Hello class, and welcome to the video lecture for Corporations and Bonds Payable. The third learning unit covers amortization of bond discounts and premiums using the interest method. The journal entries for recording transactions are the same, but the amount used are different than the amount determined using the straight line method. Recall in the second learning unit that the interest expense, when using the straight line method, was the same amount each time. The interest method makes the interest expense a different amount each time. It's based on a percentage of the bond carrying value. Since the bond carrying value changes every year due to amortization of the discount or premium, a percentage of that amount will also change every year. The amount to be amortized is the difference between the interest expense and the interest payment. This will be clearer when we look at an amortization schedule. We have Yang Corporation, who is issuing $200,000 of 12% 10-year bonds on April 1st. Interest is semi-annual, so if the bonds are issued on April 1st, interest is to be paid on October 1st and April 1st. The selling price of the bonds is $178,808. The market rate is 14%. Here we have an amortization schedule. The first column lists the periods, and the second column lists the beginning carrying value. We start with $178,808. That's the selling price of the bonds. The third column is the interest paid to bondholders. This doesn't change. It's the face value of the bond times the interest rate printed on the bonds, which is 12% times 6 divided by 12, which is the time. At each 6-month period, the bondholders are paid $12,000. The next column is where it gets tricky. The interest expense, when using the interest method of amortization, is equal to the beginning carrying value of that period times the market rate. In this case, the market rate is 14%, but remember that interest rates are stated in terms of years, and we're working with half a year, so the market rate for half a year is 7%. 7% times the beginning carrying value of $178,808 is $12,517. The next column is the amount of the discount to be amortized. That amount is calculated as the interest expense minus the amount paid to bondholders. So we have $12,517 minus $12,000, which is $517. Finally, we have the ending carrying value, which is the beginning carrying value plus the amount of discount that we amortized. Let's look at the second period. The ending carrying value of period 1 becomes the beginning carrying value of period 2. The interest paid to bondholders remains the same at $12,000. Interest expense is calculated as 7% times the beginning carrying value of that period, which is $179,325. So interest expense is $12,553. The amount of discount to be amortized is the interest expense of $12,553 minus the amount paid of $12,000, so that's $553. Finally, the ending carrying value for period 2 is the beginning carrying value of period 1 plus the amortized discount, so that's $179,325 plus 553, which equals $179,878. Let's look at the journal entries. The format and accounts used for the journal entries are the same as that which we used when we calculated amortization using the straight line method. It's the amounts that are different. We take the amounts directly from the amortization schedule. For the first interest payment on October 1st, we debit interest expense for $12,517, credit discount on bonds payable for $517, and credit cash for the payment to bondholders of $12,000. At the end of the year, an adjusting entry is needed because we're in between interest payments and interest expense has been incurred. There's 3 months between the last interest payment on October 1st and the end of the year, so we accrue 3 months worth of interest expense and bond discount amortization. This means we multiply each of the amounts we determined for 6 months from the top journal entry by 3/6, or 1/2. That means we debit interest expense for $6,276.50, credit discount on bonds payable for $276.50, and credit bond interest payable for half of $12,000, which is $6,000. Remember, it's not the day to pay the bondholders, so at this point we have a liability to credit, not cash. Now we have an amortization schedule for a bond premium. It works the same way as for a bond discount. In this example, the selling price of the bonds is $224,926 and the market rate is 10%. $224,926 is the beginning carrying value. The interest paid to bondholders stays the same because it's based on the contract rate of the bonds, not the market rate. The interest expense is the market rate times the beginning carrying value, but remember we only use half of the market rate because our calculations are for half a year. So 5% times the beginning carrying value of $224,926 is $11,246. The amount of premium to amortize is the difference between the interest expense and the interest paid, which is $754. Finally, we have the ending carrying value for period 1, which is the beginning carrying value minus the premium amortization. Now we have our journal entries. We use the same amounts from the amortization schedule to journalize the entry, so we have a debit to interest expense of $11,246, debit to premium on bond payable of $754, and a credit to cash for $12,000. The year-end adjusting entries consist of half of these amounts because we're accounting for 3 months instead of 6. Now I'd like to do a problem from the book. Let's do problem 20B-4 on page 736. The 20B-4 on page 736. So instead of using the writing pad, I'm going to use Excel because an amortization schedule needs to be created. What I have here on the screen is a copy of the template that the textbook uses, and you can find this on page 723. So I'm just using this as a template. So I have some garbage still in there, sorry. So the problem says, on May 1st, Leffer Corporation issued $180,000 of 12% 5-year bonds for $193,918, yielding a market rate of 10%. Interest is paid on October 1st and May 1st. So number 1 says, prepare an amortization schedule for the first 3 semi-annual periods. Okay, so we start off with the beginning carrying value. And what is that? Well, it's given in the problem. It's $193,918. That's what it was sold for. Now we need to determine the interest paid to bondholders. So we take the semi-annual rate, and semi-annual rate just means half of the regular rate, and multiply it by the face value. Okay, so which one of these rates is the correct rate to use? Is it the 12% or the 10%? Well, it's going to be the 12% rate because that's what's printed on the bonds. That's what is used to determine the interest that's paid to the bondholders. So since we're calculating this for a half a year, we use half of that 12%, which is 6%. So I'm just going to make a little formula here for 6%, and what am I going to multiply it by? I'm going to multiply it by the face value of the bonds, which is $180,000. Okay, so the interest paid to bondholders is $10,800. Now, the interest expense that's recorded is the semi-annual market rate times the beginning carrying value. So in this case, we use the market rate of 10% and divide it by 2 because we're working with half a year. So that's 5%. And we multiply it by the beginning carrying value, and the beginning carrying value for period 1 is $193,918. So that equals $9,696. So that's our interest expense. I have my spreadsheet set up here to round to the nearest dollar, just so we don't have to look at a bunch of pennies. Okay, now premium to be amortized. The premium to be amortized is the difference between the interest paid to bondholders and the interest expense. So we subtract one from the other. I'm going to take the interest paid, $10,800, and I'm going to subtract $9,696. Alright, so I have 1,104. Now the carrying value at the end of the period is the beginning of the period carrying value, and is it subtracted or added? Is the amortization subtracted or added? We're working with a premium, so that means it's subtracted. So this is the opposite of what we were doing in the example. So we take the beginning carrying value and we're going to subtract the premium to be amortized for that period of 1,104, and we arrive at 192,814. Now I know some of you may be thinking that I could just make formulas with these, and I do know that, but I'm typing in the numbers to emphasize where these numbers are coming from. Okay, so now let's move on to period 2. So the ending carrying value from period 1 becomes the beginning carrying value for period 2. So I've got 192,814 as my beginning carrying value for period 2. My interest paid to bondholders is still the semi-annual rate of 6% times the face value of 180,000. That doesn't change. It's going to be 10,800. The bondholders get the same amount every single time. Now my interest expense is going to be the semi-annual market rate, which is half of the annual market rates. That's 5%. And I'm going to multiply that by the carrying value of the bonds at the beginning of period 2. So I'm going to multiply it by 192,814. Okay, now the premium to be amortized is, again, it's the difference between the interest paid and the interest expense. So I'm going to take the interest paid of 10,800 and I'm going to subtract the interest expense that I calculated for period 2, which is 9,641. Okay. Now the ending carrying value is going to be the beginning carrying value from period 2 of 192,814, and then I'm going to subtract the premium that's amortized in period 2, which is 1,159. Okay, now once again, I'm in period 3. My ending carrying value from period 2 becomes my beginning carrying value for period 3. So I'm going to move that 191,655 to the first column. My interest paid to the bondholders remains the same. It's 10,800. My interest expense is at semi-annual market rate of 5% times the beginning carrying value of period 3, which is 191,655. Okay, and my premium to be amortized is the difference between my interest paid to bondholders and the interest expense that I calculated of 9,583. Now my ending carrying value is going to be my beginning carrying value for period 3 minus my amortized premium of 1,217. Okay, so that was number 1, prepare the amortization schedule for the first 3 semi-annual periods. And number 2, it says prepare journal entries to record the following. So I'm going to do that right down here. So A is to record the bond issue on May 1st. Okay, when the company issues bonds, it receives cash. So we have a debit to cash. I think I need to make these a little bigger here so you can see it. Okay, so I'm going to debit cash. And how much cash am I debiting? Well, I'm going to debit the amount that the problem says was received by the company. It says they sold those bonds for $193,918. And now I'm going to credit the liability that I now have, which is bonds payable, right? And how much is that liability? That liability is the face value of the bonds, the principal, $180,000. Okay. Now, what am I missing here? And move this over a little bit. I have to make it pretty. What am I missing here? I'm missing the premium on bonds, the premium on bonds payable. Excuse me. So I'm just going to move this down just a little bit. I'm going to put my premium on bonds payable in the middle there, which is also a credit, because premium on bonds payable has a normal credit balance and I'm increasing it. So I'm going to take the difference between the amount of cash that was received of 193,918 and the face value of the bonds of 180,000 to determine my premium. So my premium is 13,918. Now part B. Record the semi-annual interest payment and amortization of premium on August 1st. Okay. August 1st. That doesn't seem right. I think they mean in this problem October 1st. They mean October 1st. Because that's the first payment date. Okay, so on October 1st we have interest expense. And how much is our interest expense? Well, this is the end of period 1. So I can get it straight from line 1 here in my amortization schedule. So I'm going to debit the interest expense I calculated of $9,696. Now I need to reduce my premium on bonds payable, and I'm going to do that with a debit. I think I need to fix this a little bit. Okay. Premium on bonds payable, and I'm going to get that amount from my amortization schedule. I had calculated that amount to be $1,104. Now, why am I debiting this? Because I started off in Part A here with a credit, and what will happen is every time you record an interest expense journal entry, you'll slowly be reducing that amount. So I'm going to reduce it with a debit. Okay, and then finally, the last part, I'm going to record my payment to the bondholders, cash, and that's going to be a credit. And that credit amount is going to be the $10,800 that I previously calculated. Okay. Now that's it for B. Now let's look at C. The year-end adjusting entry to record interest expense and premium amortization. Alright, so it's December 31st. December 31st, and I need to record an adjusting journal entry. So how many months have passed between the last time I recorded interest and December 31st? Well, if I recorded interest on October 1st, that means that 3 months have passed. So I need to accrue 3 months worth of interest expense. And what is that going to be? Well, it's going to be half of the 6-month amount. But is it going to be half of period 1's amount or period 2's amount? I'll let you think about that for a minute while I change my highlighting. Well, as you probably guessed by which one I highlighted, it's period 2, because we're now in period 2, and it's period 2's expense, it's period 2's interest expense that we're now accruing. So we need half of that 9,641. So I'm just going to divide that by 2. Okay, so these cells I don't have to round, so please just, excuse that. That has the pennies there. That's okay for the moment. Okay, now I also have to accrue the premium on bonds payable. And again, I'm going to accrue half of my calculation for period 2. So I'm going to take 1,159 and divide it by 2. Okay, now finally, I'm going to record the bond interest payable, and that's a credit. So how much have I incurred, and it's a liability? Well, that would be half of the amount that will be owed to the bondholders. So it's going to be the 10,800 divided by 2. And I'll make that into a credit there, indent it a little bit. That wraps up Learning Unit 3, and I would strongly recommend lots of practice when it comes to learning amortization schedules and the journal entries. And I'll see you again in Learning Unit 4.